Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co-host, John, and always good to be back with, I'm sure with the summer, everybody's super relaxed, maybe even feeling de-stressed and ready, looking ahead for the new school year. One of the things that over the 3 years that we've been doing the podcast, we've had different people come and talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. This is something that has really taken a front seat in international schools. There have been all kinds of ups and downs and deep learning and important learning going on, reflection on maybe how this has not been addressed in the appropriate way, how maybe we haven't always been very transparent and open about diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in the realm of international schools. We know that there are a lot of talk about hiring practices. We had Pauline O'Brien, we've had Pete Kennedy, all talking about how this conversation has permeated into the hiring practices and how schools are looking for professional learning, getting coached and mentored and guided. At the same time, within the school curriculum, we always have had, generally, I would say, international schools, a multicultural lens. But maybe we have not really taken the time to look at some of the biases that we bring to the table. And sometimes that multicultural lens has been through the lens of one stakeholder group and maybe not often a marginalized group, especially when you think of our curriculums. I know in my own context, I have worked with teams on the infamous Explorers unit, which usually focuses on our friend Christopher Columbus. And you think there's only one person that's ever discovered anything in the world. And working and looking at other explorers from non-European backgrounds. And there are many out of China, out of Africa, out of South America, and also redefining the word of explorer, and also realizing that not all explorers have to be men. These kind of conversations and introspections are so important because today, if we look at the political landscape that we're in and looking at how some of the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are really just being erased or ignored, or very concrete changes in policy that changing the capacity to have these conversations and ensure that everybody is treated equally, and that we understand that for humanity and for day-to-day health and well-being and educating children, we need to have that very humane, open, empathetic, and multicultural capacity to look at ourselves and reflect and also understand how it's important that everybody has a voice. We can't talk about agency in an IB curriculum if we don't give agency also in the areas that we focus on, be it in literature or be it on any type of curriculum. I'm going on, but I think this is a super important conversation, and especially I think where we are today, and if you read the paper, there's even more reason to really be engaging with this and looking at what can we do in climate. And I feel very privileged to have two educators who have been really in the forefront of this. Yasmine Hashmi, who is an educator in an international school, but also is doing work with ECIS, DEIJ, Leadership Development Cohort, and also teaching a course, and has been very much involved in looking at this, fostering a holistic and globally minded perspective on the topic. So I'm really happy to have her here today. And with us is Nunana Nyomi, who's an international school leader and also works with Yasmine on the leadership cohort. He's done a lot of work in DEIJ at university as an educational leader, as a counselor, and he is absolutely passionate about this topic. And if you haven't had the opportunity to take their course with ECIS, I highly recommend it. I know they really provide such a rich landscape to work on these ideas and also be concrete about how we can implement these and bring these conversations to the forefront, not only as educators, but also with our students. So Nunana and Yasmine, thank you so much for being part of the International Schools podcast today.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
So I want to jump in because both of you have worked in international schools for many years, and you have worked in DEIJ and maybe longer than the term was even around, because it is a term that's kind of percolated, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would say in the last 10 years. What have you noticed as you both have worked in schools? How has the conversation around DEIJ changed over time? And maybe what are the key moments in your respective careers where you saw suddenly a real shift and either we start moving forward and you felt that now we had some traction? Maybe Yasmine and then Nunana?
Yeah, sure. When I reflect back at my international school journey, John, quite honestly, it goes back even when I was a child, because I am a former international school student. And I vividly remember, I mean, I've been to 6 different international schools growing up. And I vividly remember the international days, the international nights, and how we always talk about like the flags, the festivals, the food, the fashion. That was very much in the forefront. And the language at that time in the 80s, which seems like a really long time ago, was about tolerance and multiculturalism. And I remember as a child, or even going into high school, it really bothered me, that term tolerance. Like, why is it that difference is being tolerated? However, as I went into education, trained as a social justice educator in Canada, I was exposed to the social justice educator instead. And that's where the concept of identity, diversity, justice, and action came into play. And then when I actually moved into the international school system, we were still using tolerance. As we look at the, like around 2010, we were still saying we need to create tolerant conversations, like we need to tolerate each other. And I think that when we look at different events that happen in the world, we see injustices. I think mankind in general, we don't settle well with injustice, any kind of oppression. It brings out a side that, as human beings, we don't like it, and being othered. And that term tolerance just doesn't do it justice when it comes down to coming to the table, being respectful. And so I think just looking at the way the world has changed, I think that we've moved away from tolerance, and it has become more of creating spaces of respect. And I think that's a lot more inclusive in that respect, in terms of what it means to be in a community where there are a lot of differences. And so I feel that with international schools, because we are a transient community, the change has been very slow in comparison to, let's say, Canada, for example, where I'm from, where I had most of my later education. And it's like I feel that right now, where I was 15, maybe about 18 years ago, the conversation is now being talked about what it is 18 years ago in Canada, now in international schools. And so I think that, of course, like society is changing, but I think now it's more about respect and creating community.
I love that history, that kind of the case study that you give about that word tolerance, because I think we hear it a lot, and I think sometimes it's like you said, we shouldn't just have to tolerate. And I love the transition that you talk about this idea of respect, inclusivity. I think that's just so important, and especially that you, from your multicultural background, being in international school, we have had third culture guests, and also Ruth Van Westerheimer, who was here and really talked about that kind of international day, how that really didn't help a lot of kids. It didn't feel very international. Nunana, what are your thoughts, kind of building on Yasmine's ideas?
Yeah, I think in a way there's been some similarities in terms of background and upbringing, having grown up myself in 5 different countries and experienced this all the way back from childhood. Um, Definitely that idea and emphasis on food flags and festivals and kind of superficial nature, it was something that I also noticed. For me, what marked my education was this idea of kind of a certain dominance of a certain point of view. So it was always, we love being international, but you need to speak English. You know, we love being international, but this is, we're going to teach you British history, or whatever. So there was clearly kind of a hierarchy, and also even within the social order, a hierarchy. Basically, the closer you were to mimicking the teachers, who were predominantly more Western in nature, um, backgrounds, then kind of the more social capital you were getting. So the messages underneath were, while we value the diversity, there's clearly kind of an order to things. Um, so that kind of colored my own experience, growing up. I then took a detour and went to university in the United States. And I actually happened to live on a multicultural floor. So people came from all kinds of different backgrounds. And the focus was on issues like anti-racism, focused on inclusion and all these things before they became huge buzzwords. Um, and that for me, I think, was my real awakening. It was a time of really seeing, the power of activism, but also the power of, um, kind of recognizing what biases are, how to interrupt them, how to work on systems, how to affect change. And so I took that learning. I went into professional life, working in admissions and putting systems in place towards creating more inclusive communities within, the university I worked in. But eventually, my life took me back to international schools, working for the Council of International Schools. And I had a similar kind of experience to Yasmine, of thinking that while we have advanced so far in other aspects of society, other groups are doing so much, and the international schools seemed at that time not to have moved that much. It was very much still on the kind of more superficial end. Schools advertising the passport countries and saying, look, we have diversity. It's wonderful. But not really going underneath and really doing the deeper work of, is there a true sense of belonging for everyone that's coming into the community? What type of, kind of, inspirational messages are you sending? What role models are in place? Um, and what opportunities are you putting in place? How is there equity? Um, Not just on neurodivergence, which is something that really has come up, that I see as a marking point earlier on in the international school kind of trajectory, but also in other forms of identity too. Um, so yeah, I would agree definitely that, that was the experience that I saw. And then George Floyd happened, which was at first seen as a US issue until the, groundswell was too much. There were too many alumni, too many students, too many parents, other people expressing the challenges that they had seen and being vocal about it. And that would, for me, be the one of the turning points that I saw in recent years. Um, of course, there were a lot of schools that were doing the work beforehand. Um, but we did see a watershed moment where schools were starting to put out statements. And it's interesting to live in this moment now, where you start to see that almost rolling back, because the schools that weren't necessarily committed to begin with, now that it's no longer politically viable, or there's any particular challenge in place, are saying, you know what, it's time to be quieter about that. Let's not touch that diversity thing anymore. That seems like a hot potato. Let's go for the next flavor of the month. And so we're at this juncture now for international schools where we really have to demonstrate, how serious are we about the values and the ideals that we preach when we talk about global citizenship, international mindedness, and all these different lovely buzzwords. How are we going to practice what we preach in terms of inclusion of all within our communities?
I think it's so interesting that you bring up your anecdote about when you went to university. It was more activism, anti-racism, more action-oriented. And then this moment of George Floyd that all of us witness kind of was, I would say, the tip of the iceberg, and things kind of really came to life. your point's a really important one, because now when you think of, as you said, the pushback on DEIJ work, whether because it's of shifting, politics, or even maybe some schools will say tighter school budgets. Have you had to deal with people questioning or challenging current efforts based on this shift? In other words, how does a school, like you said, are we going to continue to have these deeper conversations and more than just the fluff of the UN Day and diversity and throwing words around, but really doing the curricular work, the self-reflection? I'm wondering, how are you both keeping that going, and what are some things that people can do? Because, if suddenly a role is taken away or financially a program is no more viable, these are some significant challenges. And I would love to hear what are some things, because you are working with school leaders around the world. You have this cohort, and I imagine this is starting to happen and being expressed. I think it'd be really good for our audience, especially people working in this space or school leaders and educators, saying, okay, how do we keep the flame going even though there might be all these headwinds facing us? And I'll leave maybe Yasmine to start again, and then Nunana.
I think it's important, first of all, to ask yourselves, as an organization, why was DEI put in place? The actual acronym, it's just an acronym at the end of the day, right? But why do DEI work? What was the purpose and the drive in implementing something that, celebrated and acknowledged diversity, ensuring that equity was in place so that way everybody is treated fairly, and then driving inclusion within one's community? What's the reason why you would actually do something like that? And for me, it's about developing community and those very important connections that you need to have to foster what true internationalism or global mindedness is. Because DEI, the thing with DEI is that it brings in accountability. It relies on communication to establish clear expectations and commitments. And then communication requires transparency to foster trust and credibility. And then, that transparency ensures that accountability mechanisms are fair and consistent. So why? I think that's the big question. Why would we do it? And it's really to create community that is fair, and everybody feels that they're part of a bigger story, a bigger art within one's school, within one's society, within one's community, as in like neighborhood, in the country. It's a lot bigger than just the acronym. And I think school leaders really need to think about, of course, you can shut down the DEI program, but then why did we do it in the first place? And I think that's the big question that all leaders should be asking.
I think it's so important you bringing that up, because I think, in the context of being in a school, there's nothing more powerful to expose children to that reflective process. Why are we doing this? What does community look like? How does community become viable where everybody has a voice and everybody's equal? Those kind of things are really, I think, especially in the climate that we are, if we can instill this even at very young ages. And I know in some schools that I've worked with, they're even doing it at kindergarten with different types of books, and even really thinking through literature how you can amplify that message. So I really appreciate the question that you're asking, is why are you doing it? And then really understanding, because it's bigger than those acronyms, and community transcends everything, because that's what keeps us kind of together and alive and happy and healthy. Nunana.
Yeah, I agree that at this moment in time, it's really about getting back to the basics and reminding ourselves that at heart, for schools, we first have to look at student safety, and then looking at how do we create environments where students are able to flourish. If we're starting there as our baseline, inevitably you're going to address issues of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, whether you use the words, whether you don't. If you're running a school correctly, you can't run it without having run into how do you create the space possible for students with various identity types to engage, to feel seen, feel supported, to feel heard. That's really at the heart of the work, ultimately. So, you know, I also like to cite a book by Michelle B. Junkin called The Wake Up, because one of the early chapters talks a lot about kind of your why, as Yasmine was talking about. And what we're witnessing right now is that schools are having to reckon with that why. And there are some whys that are more sustainable than others. So, for instance, you have the why that is the business case, doing it because it's good for business. Well, if that's your only why, as soon as there's a financial challenge, you're going to essentially not prioritize that. If your why is because it's good for, because it's the right thing to do, the moment it creates exhaustion and you have to put yourself on the line and you have to put your values on the line, you're going to pick other values that have more precedence. But if your why is really focused on kind of this liberation of all of us together, that I can't be whole if somebody else is suffering, then there is a space for us to work together. And so that's where schools need to be living in, is to be thinking about how can we be whole communities if there are individuals who are still struggling. And if there are, then we still have a mission according to our missions and value statements where we still have work to do. So that's where I think schools, if they're searching for ways to go forward, it's looking into that why and really anchoring that with their values and their mission, and still doing that work, regardless of what the names are that they put alongside it.
I think your point's interesting about how the names and even the acronyms sometimes I think, and I would love to hear your thoughts, almost do a disservice, because you're talking about if we have a mission about inclusivity and respect and understanding and supporting everybody, then that's where the deep work goes. And these missions and have been around, I mean, we've had missions prior to DEIJ work, but maybe, and what you're really saying is if we have this mission and we talk about a sense of community and everybody feeling safe, that's a really big word that you used. And I think it's so important, and feeling included, and not just from one perspective, but everybody's in there, then that's something that doesn't need a label almost. It's just about being good human beings and ensuring that everybody is involved. Do you find that now, when in the work that you're doing with school leaders, that you're finding you have to really spend time highlighting that? Or do you feel that people are people asking the why as they come to these challenges and are going to be stronger than maybe that the financial money's not there or that position's no more available? I'm just curious, what are you hearing from schools as you engage and support them, especially with your leadership cohort work? No. What are some of the things you're hearing from schools?
Sure. Well, this phase now that I'm in, working across and listening to other school leaders, it's about even just doing my own day-to-day work as well, and also facing similar pressures, and also, comparing notes with others to see how do we move forward in these areas. I think one point that's important to distinguish is, I think anybody who looked at equity and inclusion as a kind of budget piece solely might be missing the mark, in the sense that it's everyone's job. So it should already be in the job description to begin with. If you really want to make it systemic, it's more about saying, this is part of the requirements as part of being in our institution, that you're going to foster an inclusive climate, that you're going to foster a place where diverse voices and perspectives can be represented. And then as part of your evaluations and as part of the culture, it's just already embedded in there. So that's, for me, the kind of conversations that come up. But yes, indeed, we have loads of financial pressures as schools these days. If we look at the world economy and the volatility that's taking place, and of course, the rise of more nationalist points of view or kind of isolationist points of view. How does that really threatens the very paradigm sometimes of internationalism, even the kind of the parameters around which international education was built. And so that's where I feel like schools are at a crossroads. And if they try to address that crossroads by going for just business and saying, okay, we're just going to do what society says is the most important thing, and not really anchoring it down on the values, then we miss a point there. And it's not really long-term thinking. So obviously there's things you have to do in the short term to try to adjust to challenges that take place, but you can mitigate against that by kind of spreading that message that it is everyone's role. So even if you aren't in a resource position to resource something that accelerates change, you can also still accomplish that by devolving the responsibilities and leading by example.
And I think as you share the idea of anchoring it in the values, and that really gives you a long-term kind of view, is something that doesn't require a special office or a special fund, because it's really about teaching as a human being in many ways. And I think your point's a really important one, is maybe if we put a budget to it, then we think it can only survive, or it's only kind of siloed in that little area of the school. But you're saying, hold on, it's not about that. It's about everybody being part of the conversation and taking ownership of that reflective process and anchoring values to these ideas. Yasmine, have you, does this echo with your own work and your own situation? Because you both work together, but you also work separately on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that, there's a lot of research around how paradigm shifts happen, right? And so one of the research that comes to mind is by Kenneth Kushner, who devised the intercultural development continuum. And when you look at the continuum, right, it starts off with denial. Oh, it doesn't happen at our school. Not at our school. We're an international school. But I think that once DEI came in the forefront, it allowed individuals within leadership and within the school communities to question that, yeah, we're international, but there's something missing. It kind of facilitated the conversation. But now that DEI is kind of being, it's not very popular anymore. It's being removed from the budget and whatnot, and school leaders are backing away from the acronym. It again goes back to the why. But if you think about the continuum shift, you started off with denial, then there's the polarization, you judge the difference, then the minimization, you start to de-emphasize the differences, and then after that was the acceptance. Yeah, perhaps there is difference there, there's you start to comprehend what that difference means. And then finally, the final stage in the intercultural development continuum is adaptation. And that's when you bridge across the differences. And there's that saying, that diversity brings strength within one's institution. It facilitates innovation. And there's reason why, because it's difficult to have conversations with individuals who come from different cultural norms that are not similar to yours. However, if you learn about those differences, you learn how to bridge between them, the differences, then you truly do achieve, I'm losing my words now, strength. And it goes back to what is innovative thinking, so you think of Stephen Johnson's work. Innovation comes from the collaboration and the exchange of ideas. And if you bring all of these ideas together, it's win-win for the community, and so in terms of just, being able to facilitate that conversation is so important. So even if it is, DEI is off the table, it's beyond, and as I have already said, it's beyond just the acronym. It's bringing innovation into our organizations, bringing purpose, so that way we have a community, that community feel for everyone. And then question, it's not about the dominating culture, because every international school has a dominating culture, but how do we elevate all individuals so they all belong? And so if we collect data, if 75% of the community feels like they belong, what about the 25%? What are we going to do to make sure that everybody has that sense of belonging? What is missing in the communities? We do not need an acronym for that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because both of you are really saying that an acronym is there, but this work is beyond the acronym. It is something that's endemic, that is weaved into every aspect of a school day, be it in the cafeteria, on the bus, in the classroom, in a staff meeting, that this idea of community and diversity really bringing strength to the possibilities that a school can engage with is just so important. One of the things I'm curious is, with the work that has been done, and a lot of amazing work. I know there is a lot of criticism. We haven't done enough in schools and hiring, etc. But I think we do need to give credit where it's due. Is there are a lot of individuals and organizations like you yourselves, both of you, and other organizations have really come up and really tried to put the spotlight on this conversation, and using the acronym just for ease and to give it a label. But do you feel that there's enough traction now that schools, that if there's this blip or there's no money or the DEIJ label goes away, are we already well in motion for this to keep going, and it doesn't matter what headwinds come from the side? Or do you feel this is really a bigger challenge than anticipated? Nunana, you want to start?
So I think it's dependent on the school and the situation. Again, if your foundations were based off of we're doing this because of it's the fad of the day, then yeah, your foundations are not strong enough to weather some other fad of the day now becoming more important and taking the precedence. And so then that's what we see when schools say, you know what, yeah, I don't know, I guess we're going to cut that, or we're not going to emphasize that anymore because it's not expedient for us. If your foundations really truly are built around inclusion, as you say, these mission statements and values and the practices that have been going on in some schools for a long time, decades and decades. And so if you have that truly embedded within a community, it shouldn't matter whether there's specific challenges that are going on the outside. There's still a sense of the school community as its own community. I always say all politics is local. You have to start first at the local level of your own sphere, of the community you can affect, the people around you. How are we building the systems around those people to make sure that they're enfranchised, to make sure that they feel a strong sense of being in community, they're contributing, that they're learning, because you can't really engage in learning if you're not fully kind of valued in a space. And so I think as long as our communities are doing that, the communities that are anchored that way, I see that they can weather these storms that come through and these challenges because they're focused on their community and how they can make those changes, the systems that they built that are robust and resistant to these changes compared to those who are just a passing fad.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting how you emphasize that if you're anchored in these foundations and these beliefs, that anchoring, it almost creates, a very solid baseline to keep going, and whatever the challenges are, it doesn't matter because your community, and you said also politics starts local, as you're really thinking about the building or the campus that you're working with and the community that you're interacting with, and that's very manageable, and those are conversations you can have face to face or through a variety of different activities. I really thank you I think that's an important message, is to really kind of almost reflect, where did you start this journey and why? And if that's the reason, chances are you have more ammunition to move forward and be sustainable. Yasmine, your thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the quote comes to mind from Marcel Proust that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And so, what may seem like a new era, oh my goodness, we don't have DEI anymore within our respective school communities, we don't have the budgeting. You need to see the situation with a new perspective. And of course, the challenge is there. But looking within your community, how can you still facilitate those conversations? And John, you mentioned that there's some amazing work that's happening out there. It doesn't mean that the conversation stops. The conversation continues, but the space has changed. And I quite often always say that inclusivity is about change. Because if we look at our understanding of inclusivity 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was very different to what it is today. And I feel that the reason why our understanding of inclusivity has changed is because no matter what obstacle as a human race that we have experienced, the conversation kept going. Resistance will always be there.
Yeah.
It will always be there, I think. There will always be individuals, governments, personalities, you name it, who will cause barriers. But I think now that we're in this age of technology, the ability to communicate and to gather people and to get ideas and to connect we're at a, it's a gift, you know, it's a gift for making those connections and continuing those conversations. Because if you feel stuck, there are a lot of platforms out there that you can go and seek advice, have those conversations or affinity groups that you can go and talk to and get ideas, because it's hard, you know, when, you know, your voyage is not quite steering in the right direction, you feel stuck, but it's like, okay, what do I need to do different to make sure that I'm still on track in terms of what it is we need to do within our split communities, within society, so that way we just won't stop. And I don't think that's part of human nature either. I think we're part of a community, and it goes back to that concept of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, and we are because I can be, and I can be because I have my community, and we need to go back to that and keep those conversations going, no matter what intersectional identity you come from. Even if you're the only one, connect with individuals who are different. And a lot of times the hurt may look different, but it feels the same. And so it's making sure that those conversations keep going and not to stop. And I know it's hard, but I think that's part of, I guess you say, growing pains, you know?
Yeah, growing pains. And always, you know, I think, you know, you always talk to children, it's the process that's more important than the final outcome, right? And the process requires rigor, there's challenges, and in the process, that's where the learning goes, is, you know, the Japanese culture is very much about the way, the road is more important than the final destination. And all through that, you really gain so much learning and experience. You know, I'm one group that, you know, we haven't had students on here because it's just sometimes complicated with GDPR and everything. I'm being facetious here. We should have more students. But one of the questions I have to you, how have you seen students, because you both have been in educational institutions. Nunana, you have the luxury of also having been in higher education and now international schools. I'm wondering, what are you noticing about students with this idea of community and equity? How are they voicing that? Are you seeing connections that maybe you didn't see before, especially maybe to groups that are more marginalized, or maybe were not kept silent, but decided to be in the shadows because it just felt more comfortable? I'm just wondering, what are you seeing from students, and what kind of changes have you seen since kind of there has been more focus on this conversation? Nunana?
I've been really fortunate to join the community that I'm in right now at the International School of Geneva and the nation's campus specifically, because there's again a strong foundation that was built. That we have a very strong anti-discrimination committee, and I have to give a lot of credit to Yasmine Sadri, who did a lot of work to help cultivate this within our community, as well as Jim Williams, my predecessor as principal. Um, by providing the space to students to show agency, it really has helped our school flourish in some amazing ways. We've had students draft language guidelines that teachers are able to use in terms of, right use of equitable or inclusive language. We've had students draft an anti-discrimination statement that was once just for this campus, but now has gone through each of the campuses within our entire foundation. Um, you know, we've had them lead events such as the Pride celebrations and other, identity-based celebrations, and it's great to see them work. Last week we had Africa Day, and it was great to see our students of African background, and not just focus on the flags of the festivals and everything, but actually present a curated presentation talking about some of the history and the issues in Africa and the diaspora further, and the links to why this day exists in the first place. So doing more education around things, and that students are taking the lead on these. It's really amazing to see. Um, and as a result, because of that, what I see with students in this local setting is when things happen where they're maybe in disagreement or they feel like something should be done differently, there's a real sense of access to the powers that be, so to speak, and an ability to advocate and share what the challenges were. And and I think it's in our DNA as well to have student voice, whether it's I remember my own interview to be here, we had students involved, no matter which aspect of the community, there's always seems to be an embedding of student voice. I think of our strategic planning process. We've had students sit in the different design teams for our strategic plan. So having those voices, I think, has created a community where students understand and know how to use their voice effectively. And it's been a real joy to see them develop in that. Obviously, missteps along the way, messiness along the way, but I think it's a real fun place to be. So in that sense, yes, it's really positive to see the student engagement. But I don't know if it's throughout every school, and I'm sure that there are challenges elsewhere, but I would say for schools, that's the model. We need to think about ways to give the students voice. They know a lot more in equity and inclusion work. It's kind of a flipped paradigm that the students have a lot to teach us too, based on the experiences that they've been going through. And so we need to take more time to listen to them.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, this idea that the students actually have experiences that maybe we are not aware of. And a lot of them have moved around much more than many international school educators. We do move around, but we tend to stay good. But there are some kids that are constantly going through revolving doors to other different international schools. I also think your point's an important one. If you create a structure and where student voice is validated, then they're going to come back even more stronger because they know it's a safe place. And that validation is part of a decision-making process, as you highlighted in the strategic plan, and you having student voice. So I really, it's so interesting to hear that. And I think the other point that you bring up, it's local to your context, and really to say that's going to be everywhere, it's really hard to say. But I think from my experience, and I doubt you would disagree, international schools do try to make student agency part of the journey, the learning journey. As you said, Nunana, it can be messy, there can be missteps, but I think often the heart is in the right place. And when we have those voices, it's so interesting how much they bring to the table. And as you said, their perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion is so richer and different than maybe what we might have. Yasmine, your experience with students and kind of the transition and how these changes might be occurring in your context.
Yeah, it's very similar to Nunana. I feel that as educators, we need to see ourselves as facilitators as opposed to individuals who impose what our views are of the world. So how are we within our classroom context, opening a window into the world where a lot of students may not have that exposure to, but yet we have a very strong involvement with the Brown Square and with particularly connections with the local community, involving students in the interview process for, leadership selection, involving students within committees related to belonging as well as future pathways. And I guess it's just very similar to Nunana. We do have the international festival as well, but it's also facilitating those conversations beyond those events. And in events like, within the school, like we have a Phoenix Club, for example, where we have students driving conversations about the LGBTQ plus community as well. But yeah, like very similar to Nunana, we have some instructors as well.
I always think it's so wonderful when you're in a room in a school setting and you have a group of kids that start, having opinions and perspective and ideas. And it's rich because sometimes they come from an angle and you're like, wow, didn't think of that. So it's nice to hear that you're in two contexts where that student voice can be very active, and that creates that sense, as you've been talking, where everybody feels included. I'm sure there are people around the world today that are feeling that there are a lot of challenges, and that the climate and some of the things that are happening and reading the newspaper can be really challenging, and to keep kind of positive and keep that energy and really keep moving forward. I wonder for each one of you, because you are very passionate, you both are involved in international schools, but also professional learning for adults. What is your biggest challenge, and maybe what excites you about that challenge in this work? Nunana?
I would say biggest challenge might be how to keep us focused on those key precepts, our mission, our values, the things that we have held dear amid challenging times where budgets or other politics or whatever else social pressures come into play. Trying to juggle those two things, and try to kind of elevate people from the uncertainty and remind us of what does make us certain. So in our case, International School of Geneva, we've got our 100-year anniversary. And so reminding everyone that there is a staying power here based on a lot of the ideals and perspectives that have been there. And we will still be here. But we get to have an influence on what kind of community will be here. So let's talk about that. And let's continue to focus on those pieces of looking out for one another. This year for us, this past academic year, was all about togetherness, was the big theme that I tried to keep kind of pushing on to people. I kind of took inspiration from Lilo and Stitch. So this idea of the quote that says, nobody gets left behind or forgotten. So let's just start there. Just make sure, who are we forgetting? Who have we made sure everybody's along for the ride? And as long as we're taking those types of decisions together in consultative ways, then we're getting the best ideas on the table in order to address the challenges that we may face. And that's practicing inclusion. It's not saying that every voice will be, will get their way, but it's saying you will be heard. We will listen. We will try to get as much input as we can to make informed decisions about how we address the challenges we have, so that even within these challenges that are now facing various schools, we have the ability to practice what we preach through it and how we address those things. And surely we're going to be the better and the brighter for it. So that's for me what gives me hope is being able to see people, to bring people together, to tackle the various challenges, and not be kind of held back by the pressure, so to speak, and let that be the dominant, but rather our values themselves.
And you come back to this idea of values as kind of the central piece, the pillar of everything. And if you focus on that, then some of these challenges just seem inconsequential compared to the importance of the values that you're working with. Yasmine.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Nunana. I always appreciate your insightfulness on in this area, and I'm always constantly learning from you. The challenges can be disheartening, you know, and I think that yes, we have hope, but also we need to share the compassion within our community as well as towards ourselves. That the work is hard; it's never going to be easy because there's so much investigation work behind DEI, and you have to be an inquirer a lot of times, and it can be exhausting. But we need to be compassionate with ourselves and others, because not everyone is as passionate as you. Like as in myself, you know, not everybody is going to see the injustices as clearly as perhaps myself, or maybe I'm missing a lot of the injustices and others are seeing. And I think it's a journey. It's definitely a journey. And I feel that advancing DEI work or inclusion work is like chiseling a sculpture, a block of marble, and each strike of the chisel, every hard conversation that we engage in, every policy change, every moment of reflection may seem small on its own, but over time, those deliberate, patient efforts reveal something more human, more just, more true to who we want to be as a community. The form will always be there, but it's really our work to simply uncover it. And I think that's the core of it, is we have to keep being curious and to show compassion and to move forward.
And I think it's so important how you use the analogy of the chiseling at the sculpture, is this idea that these little steps, we're really talking, and Nunana, you said that too, this idea of long-termism. We're not just trying to find something short-term, we're really thinking long-term, how are we going to create the structures and the habits and the dispositions tied to these values that we're anchored to ensure that this is something that becomes part of the DNA of the institution, and the sense of community transcends whatever else might be coming around. We're coming to the end of this great conversation, and it's just so nice to also get your perspectives, because you're both really involved and so many very concrete ideas for us to walk away with and think. And I love that word compassion, because compassion is just, even the word, it's a very gentle word. It's very welcoming. It has a nice ring to it. And I think, you know, as you said, Yasmine, if we really think about this compassion and ensure that we have that in the front of center, and understand that not everybody is going to be as excited or engaged, but that we need to understand with compassion maybe why that is and what we can do to kind of support them along the road. We always ask our guests as we wrap up is, what would you want a student to walk away with on this topic, or some just something that you think for a student to reflect, and then an educator, and we put leaders and teachers into this educator label, because all leaders and all teachers are educators. Yasmine, what are your two messages that you have to students and then to educators as we bring a close to this conversation, but the topic's still very much alive and important?
Since we've been talking about community, I'd like to bring the teachers, the leaders, the educators, leaders, and the students together and say that, how can we be courageous? How could we be compassionate? And how can we be patient with each other in such troubling times? How are you going to work together as a community? I feel like we can't work in isolation. It has to be a communal approach. And so it's hard for me to simply work with, you know, pose a question individually to the student as well as the teacher and the educator, or the educator and the leader. But it's like, how are you going to come together as a community? How are you going to bridge those differences? And how will you approach it with courage and with compassion moving forward? And it's a question that should always be on the table to create communities of belonging.
So nice that you bring up this idea of community for all three stakeholder groups, and how are we going to bridge them and make it into one community, because often there can be a sense of separation for a whole variety of reasons, and just coming together, that sense of togetherness. Thank you. Nunana.
Yeah, so definitely that sense of community. I love that, bringing everyone together. Thinking about the students, you know, I think generally speaking, from my experience with students who are in these spaces, they want change now. They're only in school for a short period of time. And the fact that the system might change in 5 years, well, that's it. They're already gone and graduated. So they want to know that it's happening. And when it isn't, there's a feeling of frustration, you know, uh, feel down. And these moments where there are challenges that are around us, it's important to remind students that what they're planting, the seeds that they're planting, are going to bear fruit, that it is worth staying the course, that change does happen. And in themselves, there are lessons to be learned from the experiences that they're going through as well. So no cause isn't worth uh, engaging in if it aligns with, again, your values and the ideals that we want to promote around inclusion. So for students, it's, this is worth the effort. You will see silver linings. I've led change in a lot of situations in my past careers, and I always felt in the moment that we weren't going fast enough. And then a few years later, I've looked back and said, wow, we've actually taken a lot of steps. So it's trying to remind them of celebrating those small successes and staying the course. With educators, for me, it's uh, reminding them that you can't be fully whole in these spaces if there are people who are suffering, and that our responsibility in these spaces is to see who is being left behind, and what are we going to do to make sure that our spaces, our classrooms, our learning communities are set up for their flourishing, for their enjoyment, for their ability to have a voice, and really be critical about that always. Who's being left behind? And finally, what will that legacy be for you? You might not be remembered in terms of by name. Obviously, we all want that. We always want to be that favorite teacher to somebody. But what's more important than that is what have we left behind in that particular community one day? Because all of our time is temporary here. So what can we do with the limited time that we have to ensure that that legacy is something that's one of inclusion, and not one where students left your experience saying, I didn't really feel seen. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. And I really so appreciate you joining us and going on this little journey, because I think we all feel, wherever you are on the spectrum of politics, there are a lot of changes going on, and not everybody's being heard. And that can be quite challenging. I just want to remind our audience, Yasmine and Nunana have their LinkedIn profiles, and Yasmine has her blog there. Do connect with them. I know if you want to talk more or get resources, just reach out to them. Again, I want to remind you that if of interest for professional development, you can go to the ECIS website. And of course, Yasmine and Nunana are both involved with courses and leadership cohorts. So those might be some opportunities and venues to continue that conversation. I want to thank again the audience for your feedback and comments. They're so appreciated. We keep getting people joining our LinkedIn group, so thank you. And also, I really appreciate when people suggest guests or topics. That's really helpful. Anyway, the summer, you have a few more weeks for some schools. Some people might have already started. But I think with these ideas and thoughts that Nunana and Yasmine shared, these are some really strong things to take away into the new academic year as we continue to get this, build a sense of community. And as Nunana says, make sure nobody's left out, that everybody gets to be heard. Thank you again. And to our guests, thank you, both of you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated this time.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nunana.